There is a moment in Sam Peckinpah's 1978 film Convoy where Chris Christopherson, playing a trucker named Martin Penwalt, who goes by the handle Rubber Duck, leads a column of semi-trucks across the American Southwest in defiance of corrupt
They said it couldn't be done, but today we prove that state lines get crossed.
The convoy grows.
The American spirit
State lines
moves
get
forward.
crossed. Politicians get involved. The imagery is operatic. Chrome and diesel, open highway, shot in the golden light of the American West with a musical score that treats the whole enterprise with the seriousness of a medieval epic. The film was a box office success. It was also, in ways that its audience largely did not recognize at the time, a eulogy. The culture it was celebrating was already ending when the cameras were rolling, killed not by a single dramatic event, but by the slow accumulation of regulatory, economic, and technological changes that would, over the following 2 decades, systematically dismantle every structural condition that had made the American trucker's experience of freedom feel genuine rather than mythological. The truth about why truckers once felt like America's last cowboys is simultaneously more interesting and more complicated than the mythology suggests. It requires understanding what specific structural conditions of the American freight industry in the post-war decades actually produced that experience of freedom and autonomy, why those conditions were economically and socially unique in the history of industrial labor, and why their disappearance was not an accident or a conspiracy, but the inevitable consequence of market forces and regulatory logic that the mythology was never equipped to process or explain. We'll begin with the economics, because the mythology cannot be understood without the economic foundation that made it possible. The Motor Carrier Act of 1935 established the Interstate Commerce Commission's authority over trucking rates and routes in a way that, paradoxically, created the conditions for the trucker freedom mythology to develop. The ICC regulation of the trucking industry meant that freight rates were not set by market competition. They were set by regulatory process, which meant they were set by negotiation between carriers and the ICC, in a framework that, over time, produced rates that were stable, predictable, and in many freight categories, generous enough to support the independent owner-operator model at a level of income that made genuine economic autonomy possible. A man who owned his truck and his authority in the regulated era was not subject to the rate compression that free market competition produces. He was operating in a protected pricing environment that guaranteed him a margin sufficient to service his equipment debt, cover his operating costs, and generate a net income that, in the 1960s and into the 1970s, compared favorably with the industrial wages that represented the alternative for a man of his education and background. This is the economic foundation of the cowboy mythology that almost nobody discusses when the mythology is invoked. The American trucker's freedom was substantially underwritten by a federal regulatory cartel that protected him from the competition that would have destroyed his margins. The owner-operator who felt like a free agent, beholden to no employer, a master of his own schedule and his own destiny, was operating within a price-controlled environment that made that freedom economically viable. Remove the price controls, and the freedom becomes financially untenable for most of the people exercising it, which is exactly what happened. The Motor Carrier Act of 1980 deregulated the trucking industry with a thoroughness and a speed that the industry was not prepared for. The ICC's authority over rates and routes was substantially reduced. New carrier authority became dramatically easier to obtain. The barriers to entry that had protected established carriers and owner-operators from new competition were largely eliminated. The result was a freight rate environment that behaved the way any newly deregulated market behaves. Rates fell sharply as new entrants competed aggressively for freight. Established operators who had built their financial models around regulated rate structures found their margins collapsing faster than they could adjust their cost structures. And the independent owner-operator, whose economic viability had always been more dependent on the regulatory environment than the mythology acknowledged, found himself running harder for less money in a market that was restructuring around him in real time. The
Breaker
rate
19
compression
got your ears
that
on eastbound looking for a road
deregulation
condition update
did
near the
not
Big D.
destroy the trucker
10-4
identity
eastbound.
immediately.
Looks clear for the next 50 miles.
Identity is more
So I told
durable
him, I
than
said, buddy, that ain't
economics,
no hill, that's
and the
my
cultural
ex-wife's cooking.
infrastructure of
Oh,
CB
stop it,
radios,
you're too much.
truck stop communities,
He really
country
said
music,
that.
and
These
the
rates are
shared
killing us.
experience of the
I
open
ran
road
LA to New York in
continued
3
to
days and
generate
barely
the
cleared
social
expenses.
experience
It's getting
of
tougher
belonging
out
to
here.
something distinctive
be different.
and meaningful, even as the economic foundation of that belonging eroded. But the economic pressure was real and cumulative, and it was driving structural changes in the industry that would ultimately reshape the experience of driving a truck more thoroughly than any regulatory intervention could have managed directly. To understand why the cowboy mythology felt true before it became mythology, you need to understand what the physical experience of long-haul trucking in the 1960s and 1970s actually involved, stripped of both the romantic overlay and the retrospective critique, where a man driving a 1968 Peterbilt 359 from Seattle to Los Angeles was operating a machine that demanded his complete attention and his complete skill set every mile of the route. The 335 horsepower Cummins NH series engine under that long hood was a sophisticated piece of industrial machinery for its era, but it communicated with its operator entirely through mechanical feedback, sound, vibration, temperature gauge movement, oil pressure reading, rather than through the electronic mediation that interposes itself between driver and machine in every modern truck. The 13-speed Road Ranger transmission required active management of engine RPM, road speed, grade, and load at every shift point, with a precision that took years to develop and that produced, in the drivers who mastered it, a genuine sense of skill ownership. The skill was real. The mastery was real. The satisfaction that mastery produced was real. The route itself, before the interstate highway system was complete, and even in its early completion, passed through geography that was genuinely demanding. Donner Pass in winter. The Tehachapi Grades. The high desert between Barstow and Needles in August, where ambient temperatures could reach 115 degrees, and cooling systems that were marginal in temperate conditions became critical liabilities. A driver navigating these segments without the technological assistance of modern truck systems was making consequential decisions. Gear selection, speed management, cooling system monitoring, schedule adjustment for weather, that required real knowledge and produced real consequences when they were wrong.
Anyone got their ears on eastbound?
The isolation
copy
of
that,
the cab,
driver. Looks clear up ahead by
which
the
later
scales.
generations of truckers
Keep the
would
shiny side up, we're
experience as
rolling through.
loneliness, and which would contribute to the mental health crisis that the modern industry is only beginning to acknowledge formally, was experienced differently in the context of the 1960s and 1970s cultural moment. America in this period had a specific relationship with solitude and self-reliance that the post-war suburban expansion and the organizational culture of the corporation were threatening. The trucker who spent 3 days crossing the continent alone with his thoughts, his CB radio, and the geography moving past his windows was not experiencing a deprivation. He was experiencing something that the majority of American workers had traded away for the security of the company job and the suburban mortgage. The daily experience
The structural
of being
position,
genuinely
19th century
responsible
versus
for his
20th
own
century.
outcomes,
The cowboy,
accountable
agricultural
to
frontier
no
economy
supervisor,
versus the trucker,
measured
industrial
by
economy,
no performance
work type.
review process, free in the specific sense that freedom means the direct connection between your decisions and their consequences, with no institutional buffer between them. This experience had a specific resonance in the American cultural context that cannot be fully understood without reference to the frontier mythology that preceded it. The cowboy of the 19th century American West was not primarily a romantic figure in his own time. He was a working-class laborer, performing physically demanding and economically precarious work in conditions of genuine hardship, but for wages that were modest and in a social position that was not particularly elevated. The mythology of the cowboy, the freedom, the self-reliance, the mastery of a demanding environment, the code of honor that substituted for the institutional frameworks of settled society, was constructed retrospectively, largely by writers and artists who were processing the closing of the frontier and the transition to an industrial urban economy that the cowboy represented the alternative to. The trucker mythology of the 1960s and 1970s was constructed by the same cultural mechanism, at the same cultural moment. The transition to a post-industrial service economy that was eliminating the conditions under which physical skill, mechanical mastery, and individual self-reliance produced a viable economic identity. The trucker was not a cowboy because he rode the range. He was a cowboy because he occupied the same structural position in the industrial economy that the cowboy had occupied in the agricultural frontier economy. The last man whose work kept him genuinely free from the organizational structures that were absorbing everyone else. The CB radio was the infrastructure of this community's
Looks like we got a clear run all the way to the city
and it
gate.
deserves serious treatment as a social technology rather than a nostalgic artifact. The Citizens Band radio network that connected American truckers in the 1970s was,
The
in
scales
its
are lit up
functional
ahead. Watch for the
architecture,
bypass.
a
Rain's heavy.
distributed real-time communication system covering the
10-4,
entire
switching
American
lanes.
highway network that had no institutional management, no central authority, and no barrier to participation beyond the possession
Breaker
of a radio
19, anyone got
and
a copy on the
willingness to
westbound
use
lane?
it.
Yeah, we're looking
It
clear up
was,
here,
in
driver.
the
Keep
language
it
of a
rolling.
later technological era, a peer-to-peer network.
Breaker
Information
19, this is the
moving
Roadrunner.
laterally
Anyone copy?
between nodes without
Yeah,
passing through
Roadrunner, we
any
got ya.
central
Good, buddy.
processing point, with content determined entirely by the community of users, rather than by any editorial or regulatory authority. The
Westbound 80,
information
clear
it
past the
carried,
scales.
road conditions,
Watch for high winds at
enforcement
exit 300,
locations,
over.
weather, fuel
10-4,
prices,
copy that.
available
Breaker
loads,
19, is this
was
the Tennessee Terror
operationally
Heel?
valuable
That's me.
in ways that gave
Heard you clear
participation
back
in
in
the
Nevada,
network
partner.
a
Good to finally
concrete
meet you.
economic justification.
Breaker 19, anyone
But
got
the
their
social
ears on?
function it served went beyond the
Yeah, rubber duck,
operational
keep the shiny
information
side up.
exchange. The CB radio
So I
gave the
told him, Breaker
isolated
19,
long-haul
this ain't no
driver a
four-wheeler.
community that
10-4,
traveled with him.
Snowman.
The
You just didn't
handles,
get it.
the pseudonyms
You
that
heading
drivers
south, Grizzly?
used on the air, created a social identity that was portable, persistent across the geography the driver covered, and embedded in a community whose membership was defined by the shared experience of the road, rather than by geography, employer, or any other conventional social category. A driver who identified himself by his handle on Channel 19 in Tennessee was recognizable by that same handle in Nevada. And the community norms, the courtesy protocols, the information sharing ethic, the specific humor that developed around the shared experience of the highway, were consistent across the geography in a way that made the community genuinely national in its coherence. This was not a trivial social
Breaker 19,
achievement.
eastbound on the
The
I-80.
American
Got a
working
Smokey taking
class
pictures
in
at
the
mile marker
1970s
102.
was
Looks like a bear in the air,
experiencing
too.
a
Keep the shiny
fragmentation
side up.
of the community
Breaker
structures.
19, eastbound.
The
Watch your rear
Union
door.
Hall,
Smokey
the
taking pictures at
neighborhood,
the 100-mile
the
marker. Keep the
church
shiny side up.
that had previously
Copy that, driver.
provided
Much
social
obliged. 10-4.
coherence for industrial workers. The CB network provided truckers with a substitute community structure that was uniquely adapted to the mobile nature of their work, and that produced, in its most developed form, a genuine culture with its own language.
We talk
its
in
own
tongues
heroes,
on the CB
its own
waves, mile
narratives,
markers, and the
its
money we
own
save.
codes of conduct.
Just a rolling thunder
The
brotherhood.
language, the 10 codes, the geographic references, the terminology for enforcement and road conditions was not affectation.
The highway calls
It was
my
the
name
functional
again,
vocabulary
leaving this
of a
town
community
behind
that
the
had
rain.
developed its
Got
own
that diesel
communication
humming
system
steady in
to
my
serve
veins.
its specific operational needs. The music that emerged from and fed back into this culture, the outlaw country movement centered on artists like
Just
Waylon
me
Jennings,
and this
Willie
rig on the
Nelson,
asphalt
and
sea,
Merle Haggard,
chasing that
and the more
horizon
directly
eternally.
trucking-specific work of artists like
Yeah, the
C.W.
road is
McCall
long,
and Red
and the diesel
Sovine
burns bright,
was not
but we keep
simply
this country
entertainment.
rolling through the night.
It was the community's self-representation, the artistic form through which the trucker culture processed and communicated its values, its grievances, and its sense of its own significance. The themes that recur across this music: freedom versus constraint, the open road versus the settled life, the individual versus the institution, loyalty to peers
They
over
can build their
compliance with authority,
highways wide and
are not
fast,
accidental.
but the soul of the
They
trucker,
are the precise
buddy, that's
thematic
built to last.
content of a community that understood itself as representing something that the dominant culture was eliminating, and that was using artistic production to insist on the value of what was being lost. The 1973 oil crisis and its 1979 sequel were the first major economic shocks to penetrate the mythology with sufficient force to make the structural vulnerabilities of the trucker's position visible even to the people who were most invested in the mythology's truth. The fuel price increases that followed the OPEC embargo hit owner-operators with a directness and a severity that the regulated rate structure of the ICC framework was not designed to accommodate quickly. Fuel surcharge mechanisms that would allow carriers to pass fuel cost increases through to shippers in real time did not exist in developed form. Yet fuel costs that had represented a manageable fraction of operating expense suddenly became the dominant variable in the owner-operator's profit and loss calculation, and the rate structure was not moving fast enough to compensate. The response was the 1979 trucker strikes, a series of work stoppages and highway blockades that brought national attention to the economic crisis that owner-operators were experiencing, and that produced, in their imagery of trucks blockading highways and drivers confronting law enforcement, the most literally cowboy-esque moments in the history of American trucking. The strikes were not successful in their immediate economic objectives. Fuel prices continued to rise and rate relief was slow and partial. But they were revealing. They showed that the freedom the trucker mythology celebrated was not self-sustaining. It was dependent on external conditions, fuel prices, rate structures, regulatory environments, that the individual owner-operator could not control, and that institutional arrangements he had not built and could not protect were the only mechanisms capable of managing. The deregulation of 1980 was, in retrospect, the structural killing blow to the conditions that the mythology required. But it arrived in a cultural context where the mythology was already serving a different function than it had in the 1960s. By 1980, the trucker as American cowboy was already as much a media construction as a social reality, the product of films, music, and television that had taken the genuine cultural content of the 1960s trucker community and processed it into a marketable entertainment product that was consumed by an audience far larger than the trucking community itself. The mainstream American audience that made Convoy a box office hit
Breaker
and made
19, this here's
C.W.
the family
McCall's
truckster.
Convoy
We're
single and
eastbound and
number
down.
one record was not
10-4,
consuming these
good
products
buddy.
because they had direct experience of trucker life. They were consuming them because the trucker mythology offered a vicarious experience of a freedom and self-determination that their own organizational, suburban, institutional lives did not provide. This is the cultural mechanism that the mythology was serving by the time it reached its peak commercial expression in the late 1970s. It was not primarily the trucking community's self-representation anymore. It was a mass-market fantasy product manufactured for an audience that was using it to process its own ambivalence about the trade-offs of modern American life. The trucker was not actually free in the way the mythology required, but the mythology's consumers needed him to be free, because his freedom was the proof that freedom of that kind was still possible somewhere in America, for someone even if not for them. The systematic dismantling of that mythology's material foundation continued through the 1980s and 1990s with a thoroughness that left the cultural form intact long after the substance it had represented was gone. Electronic logging devices made the logbook freedom that had allowed drivers to run their own schedules impossible to maintain. The fuel network consolidation and the rise of the major truck stop chains replaced the independent fuel stops and diners that had been the physical infrastructure of the trucker community with standardized commercial environments that served the truckers' logistical needs efficiently while providing none of the community infrastructure that the independent stops had sustained. The rise of satellite tracking and dispatch communication technology eliminated the operational autonomy that had made the solo driver genuinely self-directing on the road. A driver in 2000 whose truck was equipped with
Just
a
checking in,
Qualcomm satellite
Crossroads?
terminal
Yeah, we're
was
making
not
good
a
time.
cowboy.
Should
He
be at
was
the
a
drop by
mobile
midnight,
node in
over.
a logistics management system, his position known at all times, his route optimized by software. No, his performance measured against metrics that had been set by people who had never driven a truck. The owner-operator model survived deregulation and survives today, but in a form that bears a relationship to its 1960s predecessor that is primarily nominal. The rate compression that deregulation produced drove the effective compensation of owner-operators below the level that the independent equipment ownership model requires to be financially rational in many freight categories, which is why the lease-operator arrangement, in which a driver owns or leases a truck but operates it exclusively under a carrier's authority and within a carrier's operational constraints, became the dominant structural form of owner-operator participation in the market. A lease operator is not an independent businessman in any meaningful sense. Why, he is an employee who owns his tools and bears his own operational risk without the protections that employment status provides. The freedom is nominal. The risk is real. The Cowboys felt free because, for a specific window of time in American economic and social
Best
history,
barbecue on
the
the whole
structural
grade.
conditions of their industry made a version of that freedom
You earned it after
genuinely
that climb.
available. The regulations
It takes
protected
real
their
skill,
rates.
not like these new
The
automated
geography
rigs.
rewarded their skill.
That's right,
The
we earned this
technology
route.
demanded their active mastery rather than their passive monitoring. The community their work created was real and coherent and meaningful. When those conditions changed, through deregulation, through technology, through the consolidation of the freight market around large carriers with the scale to absorb rate compression that destroyed individual operators, the freedom went with them. What remained was the mythology, which is, in the American cultural tradition, exactly what always remains when the frontier closes.